With that report, let's bring in for a deeper analysis Garret Martin, who's a lecturer at the American University. Garret, thank you for being with us. There is clearly a lot at stake here for both leaders, but for us too, because if this event leaves matters unsettled, the ripple effect, of course, will cross the globe.
Yes, absolutely, because considering the sheer weight of both the United States and China, the actions and the decisions that they made, whether on the field of trade or security, of course, have an impact worldwide. The decision or not for them to engage in a commercial war or to conversely try to sort of limit and lower the temperature is significant. I think what we saw today was that example. I think not much in substance, but at the very least, a desire to lower the temperature on both sides.
Okay, lowering the temperature. However, the words of Xi Jinping to Donald Trump regarding China, there was certainly something behind that. Dare I say, a threat?
Yes, I think there's at least you could call it a clear red line and a clear sense of priorities. Taiwan is presented as essentially the cornerstone, the key element in determining whether the relationship will be positive or not. And I think it was certainly ominous to talk about should there be differences or should the differences be more stern between the two countries that could lead to conflict. Now, I think conflict can mean a lot of different issues. It can obviously at the most extreme lead to armed or major confrontation. But I think it's also clear that Xi Jinping is sending a marker also domestically as to how important Taiwan is.
Indeed, it was Joe Biden, of course, who said that the US would defend Taiwan's right to be independent. But Marco Rubio has gone on record just moments ago saying that, of course, the policy isn't changing. So does this look like there could be at loggerheads, Xi and Trump?
The position of strategic ambiguity that the United States has adopted is, of course, by its very nature, creates some tension because it leaves some question marks about what exactly the United States would do in case of a major confrontation or attempt by China to take over forcibly Taiwan. Marco Rubio, of course, himself has a bit of a history because he was under sanction, was not supposed to come to China. And I think for Marco Rubio, there may also be in the background his own political ambitions here in his declaration.
I hear what you're saying, and it's interesting to have the phrase strategic ambiguity used about the United States, because usually it's a kind of phrase reserved for the Chinese, isn't it, with their standings on many issues across the globe. Can we talk a bit about the situation with Iran? Because before this, Donald Trump said he didn't need Xi Jinping's help to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened, but now we're hearing that Xi Jinping is willing to offer his help. Again, there's a lot of leeway between what's said and what's interpreted and what might happen. But clearly, there's a real interest for China to get things sorted out in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, there is, but I think you've got to be careful of the words. I mean, sometimes it's the same as saying, I should clean my room, which doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to do it. So I think there's an element here of Xi Jinping might be, yes, I'm happy to help, but what exactly that entails and how much or how far he's willing to go, I think is a big question mark. I think China is torn between, on the one hand, they see strategic benefit of seeing the United States locked or in a bit of an impasse with Iran over the Straits of Hormuz. But there's, of course, economic cost that is starting to spill over across the globe, including China. And, you know, the signs that we're seeing is that the Chinese economy seems to be slowing down a little bit at present. So I think there's certainly a bit of a dilemma when it comes to the Chinese approach towards Iran.
I love the way you put it about that difference between what you say you will do and what you will actually do. And it's a very important point to make. Trump is saying that Xi Jinping has agreed not to supply Iran with arms. Is this another one where you apply that same rule? He says one thing, perhaps he'll do a different one.
Certainly, I mean, I think, again, that can be something said at the moment, but will that remain true? Is that a binding commitment regardless of what the United States does? I think that remains to be seen. The second element is we'll also keep in mind that technically you could be sending dual use equipment that has civilian purposes, but also has military applications. So you could also be very much engaging in an exercise of linguistics. We don't know. And absent a binding commitment and a clear commitment, we should have some reason to be skeptical.
The issue of trade, of course, is something that both men will need to iron out. At one point, of course, famously, Donald Trump levying a tariff of 145% on Chinese goods. That has all been brought down to something more manageable. However, it is still a big issue for both China and for the US. There's, of course, the big trade deficit that's been a problem for the US over 10, 15 years or more. China, of course, seems to be the bigger performer in that sense. On this issue of trade, do we conclude that something like, say, soybeans is something more of a power play issue than anything else that we've been talking about?
I think what we saw last year, I believe in the October sort of deal that was made, is essentially a willingness to, as I mentioned earlier, to lower the temperature, but it doesn't really address some of the fundamental issues that are keeping the United States and China at odds. You mentioned the trade deficit, but I think it was very noteworthy that market access and equal market access for American firms has been a long bone of contention. That was mentioned in the White House version of the conversation. It did not appear in the Chinese version. Issues over forced transfer of technology. There are a number of these bilateral irritants, and there is no evidence that I can see, of course, not being in the room, but there's no evidence beyond that those fundamental issues have been resolved. So you can have sort of periods of trying to lower the temperature, but again, the differences are deeply anchored, and I see no real reason for them to be solved anytime soon.
Rare earths could be a big bargaining chip for China. Just coming back briefly to Taiwan, could semiconductors be something that keeps Taiwan in a sense of security in terms of what it will get? Will its domination of the semiconductor market perhaps help the Taiwanese to basically try to get US protection on a continued basis? Do you think there's some kind of negotiation there?
It's certainly been something that the Taiwanese, I mean, they've been investing in their semiconductor capacity for decades. I think they understand, obviously, the economic and technological benefits, but even more so now when we are in an era of economic security has become so important. I think they deeply understand the security value of being at the forefront of this technology. I think they've been very careful, I think, because it can work both ways. I think, yes, they can try to leverage that, but there is also pressure from the United States to try and move supply chains to the United States. So Taiwan is torn between the willingness to try and keep the United States engaged with Taiwan because of that, but also protect its independence for the long run.
Garret Martin of the American University, thank you for joining us from Washington. The insight and the analysis, really useful. Thank you so much indeed. The Xi Jinping, Donald Trump visit continues. The analysis from Garret, incredibly useful to understand where they might go next. And of course, we're watching for all developments. Let's bring you